Chapter 22. A Warm Wind. And so, Wilbur came home to his beloved manure pile in the barn cellar. His was a strange homecoming. Around his neck he wore a medal of honor. In his mouth he held a sack of spider's eggs. There is no place like home, Wilbur thought, as he placed Charlotte's 514 unborn children carefully in a safe corner. The barn smelled good. His friends, the sheep and the geese, were glad to see him back. The geese gave him a noisy welcome. Congratulations, they cried. Nice work. Mr. Zuckerman took the medal from Wilbur's neck and hung it on a nail over the pig pen, where visitors could examine it. Wilbur himself could look at it whenever he wanted to. In the days that followed, he was very happy. He grew to a great size. He no longer worried about being killed, for he knew that Mr. Zuckerman would keep him as long as he lived. Wilbur often thought of Charlotte. A few strands of her old web still hung in the doorway. Every day, Wilbur would stand and look at the torn, empty web, and a lump would come to his throat. No one had ever had such a friend, so affectionate, so loyal, and so skillful. The autumn days grew shorter. Lurvy brought the squashes and the pumpkins in from the garden and piled them on the barn floor, where they wouldn't get nipped on frosty nights. The maples and the birches turned bright colors, and the wind shook them, and they dropped their leaves one by one onto the ground. Under the wild apple tree in the pasture, the red little apples lay thick on the ground, and the sheep gnawed them, and the geese gnawed them, and the fox came in the night and sniffed them. One evening, just before Christmas, snow began falling. It covered the house and barn and field and woods. Wilbur had never seen snow before. When morning came, he went out and plowed the drifts in his yard for the fun of it. Fern and Avery arrived, dragging a sled. They coasted down the lane and on to the frozen pond in the pasture. Coasting is most fun there, said Avery. The most fun there is, said Fern. It's like when the Ferris wheel stops and Henry and I are in the top car, and Henry makes the car swing and we can see everything for miles and miles and miles. Goodness, are you still thinking about that old Ferris wheel? Said Avery in disgust. The fair was weeks and weeks and weeks ago. I think about it all the time, said Fern, picking snow out from her ear. After Christmas, the thermometer dropped to 10 degrees below zero. Cold settled in on the world. We know what that feels like. The pasture was bleak and frozen. The cows stayed in the barn all the time now, except on sunny mornings when they went out and stood in the barnyard in a bed of straw. The sheep stayed near the barn too, for protection. When they were thirsty, they ate snow. The geese hung around in the barnyard the way the boys hung around outside of a store, and Mr. Zuckerman fed them corn and turnips to keep them happy. Many, many, many thanks, they always said when they saw the food coming. Templeton moved indoors when the winter came. His ratty home under the pig trough was too chilly, so he fixed himself a cozy nest in the barn behind the grain bins. He lined it with bits of dirty newspaper and rags, and whenever he found a trinket or a keepsake, he carried it home and stored it there. He continued to visit Wilbur 3 times a day, exactly at mealtime, and Wilbur kept the promise he had made. Wilbur let the rat eat first. Then, when Templeton couldn't hold another mouthful, Wilbur would eat. As a result of the overeating, Templeton grew bigger and fatter than any rat you ever saw. He was gigantic. He was as big as a young woodchuck. There's a picture of him right there. The old sheep spoke to him about his size one day. You would live longer, said the old sheep, if you ate less. Who wants to live forever? Sneered the rat. I'm a naturally heavy eater, and I get untold satisfaction from the pleasures of the feast. He patted his stomach, grinned at the sheep, and crept along to lie down. All winter, Wilbur watched over Charlotte's egg sack as though he were guarding his own children. He had scooped out a special place in the manure for the sack, next to the board fence. On very cold nights, he would lay so that his breath would warm it. For Wilbur, nothing in life was so important as this small, round object. Nothing else mattered. Patiently, he awaited the end of winter and the coming of the little spiders. Life is always a rich and steady time when you are waiting for something to happen or to hatch. The winter ended at last. I heard the frogs today, said the old sheep one evening. Listen, you can hear them now. Wilbur stood, turned his ear. From the pond, in a shrill chorus, came the voices of hundreds of little frogs. Springtime, said the old sheep thoughtfully. Another spring. As she walked away, Wilbur saw a new lamb following her. It was only a few hours old. The snows melted and ran away. The streams and ditches bubbled and chattered with rushing water. A sparrow with a streaky breast arrived and sang. The light strengthened, the morning came sooner. Almost every morning, there was another new lamb in the sheepfold. The goose was sitting on 9 eggs. The sky seemed wider, and a warm wind blew. The last remaining strands of Charlotte's old web floated away and vanished. One fine sunny morning after breakfast, Wilbur stood watching his precious sack. He wasn't thinking of anything much. As he stood there, he noticed something move. He stepped closer and stared. A tiny spider crawled from the sack. It was no bigger than a grain of sand, no bigger than the tip of a pin. Its body was gray with a black stripe underneath. Its legs were gray and tan. It looked just like Charlotte. Wilbur trembled all over when he saw it. The little spider waved at him. Then Wilbur looked more closely. 2 more spiders crawled out and waved. They climbed round and round on the sack, exploring their new world. Then 3 more little spiders, then 8, then 10. Charlotte's children were here at last. Wilbur's heart pounded. He began to squeal. Then he raced in circles, kicking manure in the air. He turned and did a backflip. Then he planted his front feet and came to a stop right in front of Charlotte's children. Hello there, he said. The first spider said hello, but its voice was so small, Wilbur couldn't hear it. I am an old friend of your mother's, said Wilbur. I'm glad to see you. Are you all right? Is everything all right? The little spiders waved their legs at him. Wilbur could see by the way that they acted, they were glad to see him. Is there anything I can get you? Is there anything you need? The young spiders just waved. For several days and several nights, they crawled here and there, up and down, around and about, waving at Wilbur, trailing tiny drag lines behind them and exploring their home. There were dozens and dozens of them. Wilbur couldn't count them, but he knew that he had a great many new friends. They grew quite rapidly. Soon, each was as big as a BB shot. They made their tiny webs near the sack. That is where I'm going to stop at chapter 22, and I'm going to have Mrs. Nelson read you the ending. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed Charlotte's Web.